am Dr. Clarissa Myrick-Harris, and I am the chair of the Humanities Division and professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College in Atlanta. I have been in academia for most of my adult life. I started out actually in journalism, but found very quickly, although I enjoyed writing and research and enjoyed the interactions with other journalists and people in the world, I felt more like an observer than a participant in events going on in the world. And so at the time, this is a while ago, kind of dates me, when I was a researcher writer for what was then called Time Life Books Division, I remember having to present an argument about why we should focus on several African-American physicians, Daniel Hill Williams, for instance, who did some groundbreaking work, first open heart surgery and so on. And then there was a gentleman named Vivian Thomas, who was not actually a physician, but was technically a lab assistant who actually taught a very well-known, prominent heart surgeon how to do a procedure that he developed. Vivian Thomas was this Black man's name, who, although he was not, had never attended medical school, but could not afford to attend medical school, he was the lab assistant for a prominent physician at Johns Hopkins, and he developed the procedure to cure what was called blue babies, to repair essentially a defect in the heart of babies. And there's even a famous photograph of Vivian Thomas standing over the shoulder of this prominent cardiologist whose name I can't remember, the white cardiologist, of course. This is back in the 1940s, I believe. So there's a picture of him standing in the operating room at Johns Hopkins, where he was doing this first surgery on a baby to repair the defect that causes blue baby syndrome. And so he was so afraid to do it by himself that he had Vivian Thomas, his lab assistant, come in, and he stood on a step stool and stood over his shoulder and instructed him how to do every step in the procedure. And so I refer to that because that is an example of some of the things I recall as a journalist or as a writer for a big company, a publishing company, trying to make a case about why our history was important. And so I could go on, but I was very, very saddened, and it was just exhausting having to always prove a case why it's important to include our history, the history of African-American people. And so finally I decided to just go back to graduate school. I had a master's at that time in journalism, and then I entered the graduate program in English at Howard University, but soon found after a year that that wasn't quite broad enough, that wasn't deep enough for me. I wanted to encompass more about the history and culture of Black people. And so I came home to Atlanta, and I actually enrolled in what was called the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts at Emory University, and earned my doctoral degree in American Studies with an emphasis in African American history, culture, literature. And now I'm skipping over some parts that are more relevant to what we're talking about here, because the question is, how did I evolve into, I guess, a scholar activist is I guess what I would like to refer to myself as. So before coming back to Atlanta in the mid 90s, my late husband and I were at the University of Cincinnati. He was actually the founding, he was the director at that point of the Africana Studies, or African American Studies it was called at that point. And we established a school. And this was in Cincinnati, which is an interesting place, very conservative, quite frankly. But we established an African-centered school because we didn't feel comfortable with the public school system for our daughters. We had a preschooler, and we had a 6-year-old with learning differences. and the school just was not getting it. So we decided to establish our own and open it up to the community and have a broad cross section of students from all socioeconomic backgrounds. It's an African-centered school called the African American Academy. We served preschool through seventh grade. And this was the mid 90s, around the time of in 1995, I think we were in our second year. And it was around the time of you've heard about the Million Man March. You hadn't been born yet at that point, but that was that was a biggie, the Million Man March. And so we had a couple of our teachers to go, and everybody came back very excited about that show of brotherhood and African American male presence in support of the Black community. But that weekend, I found out when we came back to the school the next Monday after the Million Man March, I I did what I normally do. I go into the office and I started listening to see if we had any telephone messages, and we did. And so there was this recording from a woman, which was surprising, but a white woman who said, and I guess she just went through the phone book and she saw a school called the African American Academy, first one on the list. And so she called and said, "We're going to kill all your N-word babies." Okay. This is 1995. Okay, we know what's going on in 2020. So, that's, I guess, at the time, it was just amazing. So we had the police come in, they did a sweep of the school, we sent the kids home. And it dawned on us at that point how, in the minds of some people, what we were doing was revolutionary, was somehow counter to what their idea of what America should be and who it should be for. And so I think that was really the first time it occurred to me that I could categorize myself as an activist or be categorized at that. And I think that's so important to understand that sometimes when we think about activism and activists, we think about those people who are out there on the front lines in the streets leading the marches and the protests, and we have to have them out there to so that the world can see what's going on. And so what I came to understand is when you are an African-centered educator, an African-centered scholar and writer, that is a form of activism when you are writing things, when you are teaching things that, you think, it's just common sense and everybody should know, but they are things that somehow is viewed as almost subversive because it's counter to a narrative that has been projected for the story of America over the centuries. And that narrative, of course, is one that has subjugated, unfortunately, and suppressed and repressed people who are not European American, of European descent. And so my activism, I came to understand really began a long time ago, even before my graduate school experience and my teaching experience, because growing up in Atlanta, there was something, my parents were not necessarily out in the street protesting, and that's not necessarily something I did growing up. However, they were very, very intentional and very, very clear about what we, their 5 children, should do when we grew up, make the world a better place for Black people. Keep doing it. Keep doing what you're doing. And know that a reason that I wanted to do the intergenerational conversations with members of the Atlanta student movement, talking to young activists, students, and people in the community, it's not necessarily so that, although a part of what will happen, I think, is already happening, but not primarily so that they can tell you specific strategies. Well, we did this at that time, and we did that at another time, and you might do this, because there are different times. And something that one of the veterans said to me recently, well, we can learn things from them, from these young people, because you have social media and things they could never even dreamed of, have dreamt of 60 years ago, in terms of how you get out the word, how you rally the community, how you really fight for change in today's world, 21st century. But rather, I think the important thing about these conversations is to allow young people to see themselves, and to allow these older activists to see themselves. So you see yourselves in each other, if that makes sense. And that's, no, the comforting is the word, but that certainly is reassuring, to know that there are others who came before with the same passion, the same desire to promote change. And it's really, I know for a fact that it's so powerful and refreshing and comforting for the older veterans to know that young people are picking up the baton, because what many of them have said over and over, I wish we had talked more about what we did. I wish we had really mentored young people more overtly, just one-on-one, and because there's so much history that is not necessarily known. They don't get in the history books, and we can tell them, we can provide them some understanding, some context, and so I think the most important thing for young people to remember is, um, look at the history, understand what has happened before. Not that that's going to define and confine what your contributions will be in the present and in the future, but because that history, those things, those moments of activism, those individuals, leaders, foot soldiers who participated in marches and so on, because that provides you with some context, that provides you with a road map in some way, and some references, and it helps you to know that there's some people who can, in a sense, even still have your back in terms of understanding what the young activists are experiencing, what their dilemmas are, what their concerns are. So never feel you're in isolation, that no one understands, that you're out there by yourselves. It's important to look to those who've come before for that sense of kinship, of support, and when you need it, you can learn the lessons and ask for specific advice and strategies. But just their presence, I think, is so important, and to know that they do support you and they do, in a sense, have your backs. So always remember to connect. That ultimate lesson I'm talking about. Connect to those who come before to provide that energy and that support that you really need when you're out there on the front lines, because it's like being on the front lines of a battle, and the activists, the older activists will tell you, many of them developed post-traumatic stress. They didn't call it that back then, but it can be traumatic, to go through the kinds of things they went through and the kinds of things that young people are going through, many people, young and old, who are out there on the front lines. Some of the differences between the struggle, the protest, the movement for social justice, social change today. Fundamental difference is that back in the day, in the 50s and the 60s, and on into the 70s, a focus was primarily race-based, fighting for, striving for change for Black people, without really understanding the diversity among Black people, but it was the collective people, and that was good to some extent, because it provided a focus, a common goal, but at times it could undermine the efforts, because, and then, as you probably have read in terms of Black women, often pushed to the back, even though they were doing much of the work, if not most of the work. There was a great deal of sexism, and there was homophobia. And we know that one of the architects, the primary architect of many of the strategies that were used in the civil rights movement, that was led by King and others, not just King, but King and others. But one of the architects of those strategies was Bayard Rustin, who was a gay Black man. But nobody talked about that. Nobody, it was kind of hush hush, just pretend that that's not the case, that kind of thing. And so you had that focus solely on race, issues of race, without understanding the complexities and how you have to also push for social change when it comes to how Black women were treated, how gay men, lesbian women were treated, how children were treated. In the movement now, you have you have intersectionality, you have issues of race, issues of sex, issues of gender identity, all converging, because all of these people who identify in all of these ways find that they're discriminated against, find that they run up against brick walls when they try to advance themselves in their lives, their day-to-day lives. And so there's an opportunity and there's a challenge. The challenge is to bring all of the people, all of us together with the different identities, not to submerge them or even merge them necessarily, but to understand there is a common goal. There's a common goal to eliminate injustice, social injustice for us all, regardless of, sexual orientation, regardless of, of whether you are an elder or a child, and that has to be inclusive. That fight has to be inclusive for African American people, but also all people of color, and beyond that, all marginalized people. So, understanding the complexities of the movement today is very important. And again, stressing that there can be unity in diversity, that we can move together. And it's nothing wrong with making demands on all these different fronts, because it's all about ultimately achieving social justice. Yes, choose your path. Don't let anyone tell you, if you call yourself an activist, you got to do this and you can't do that, and you must make sure that you remember to to not do this as well. But that's a wrong way of looking at it. You choose your path. You decide where it is that you want to make a difference and how you feel you can make the greatest difference, and where you find your passion. It doesn't, being an activist does not mean that you can't have a life, that you can't live. Find your passion in your life. Artists, as we learned from if you go back to the 60s and 70s, that, art for the people's sake. The Black arts movement of the 70s, that was all about creating art that not only allowed people to express their creativity, but also contain a message and help a message that was meant to promote social change, social justice. So decide on what your path is, where your passion is, and where you feel you can make the greatest difference in the world in terms of promoting social change. Being out protesting in the streets may be part of it, and that's a good thing, but it may not be the only part of it. And what do you do when the protests stop? What are the ways that you are continuing to make a difference, continuing to fight for social change? So find that path. That's the message, the primary message I think that I have for young people today.